Good morning, everybody.
Morning, David.
Morning, David. That's how you do it. Okay.
Thank you for joining us again this morning, and we are particularly delighted that Dr. Robert E. Ford is with us. He's a world-class specialist in the topic we are discussing today, and we are most grateful that he's made time for us on this occasion. In the New Testament, we have 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And although these are very similar in some ways, they are significantly different in others. So we are grateful that we have all 4 Gospels. Similarly, in the book of Genesis, we have 2 different accounts of creation. The first one goes from Genesis 1, verse 1, down through Genesis 2, verse 3. And then Genesis 2, verse 4 is not a continuation of what preceded it, but it's the beginning of a brand new story. So we have here 2 stories of creation, and one can tell quickly the difference, because in the first story, the deity is called God, and in the second one is called Lord God. So there are other differences as well. So the best guess these days is that these stories circulated in oral form for untold numbers of generations, and then somewhere along the line, people wrote them down, and then after that, people gathered them together in collections. Probably they started doing that about the time of the Babylonian exile, and it wasn't done until well after the time of Jesus. So this issue of bringing together the texts into one collection took quite a while. Now, the ancients could have given us one creation story. They could have said, this is the one we think is best, but they didn't. They gave us both, and we are therefore the beneficiaries of their generosity. I've asked Bronwyn to read from Genesis chapter 2, which is the second creation story. I've asked her not to read the whole of it, but those portions of it which are particularly relevant to today's discussion. So, Bronwyn.
Okay. This is Genesis chapter 2, first of all, verses 4 through 9. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils and the breath of life. And man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then verses 18 through 25. And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet.
I came home and Alexa was clinging to Peggy.
Could we have some muting, please? And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed.
Thank you, Bronwyn. As she read, the text says, a help meet for Adam. That is, a help appropriate or fitting. It does not say help mate. It says help meet for Adam. Someone who is, if you look at the Hebrew, it says someone who's corresponding to Adam. That's the best translation I can come up with. So we will start with prayer, and as soon as we have prayer over, I will make Monty a co-host because I now see his name. So I thank Monty and Forrest both for being co-hosts, and they make things a lot more smooth for us. Let's begin with prayer. Dear God, we are thankful for these old, very old stories, and we are thankful for those who recorded them and gathered them together and helped us to benefit from them today. We are mindful that these stories talk about the origins of the world in ways that are intended to help us know how to live today, not to satisfy our curiosity about the past, but to help us live today. May we keep that in mind as we consider what Dr. Ford has to say to us today. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, I'm just going to make Monty Butler, I keep saying Murdoch, Monty Butler, a co-host, and Bob, you can go ahead anytime you want to.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Do you have to make me a co-host to be able to do that?
I can. No, you don't have to. We're hearing now. But if I make you if I can just hold on just for a second. Sure. If I make you a co-host, let's see.
You don't need to do that. All you need to do is go to screen share settings and
no
allow other participants to share their screen.
Okay, we're fine.
Now I've made Bob a co-host, and I think if I mute all, he will be the only one able to speak. Let me try that. Okay, that's not working. Just a second, Bob. I've got to
or Bob, you can just unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay, I'm fine. Can everyone see me okay and see the title slide?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, what I want to talk about today is a very big topic, and we may continue next week as well. So if you have questions, please write them down and we'll talk about them. We're talking about creation care. This is where the creation story comes into it. Climate change and biodiversity loss. If any of you don't understand the word biodiversity, this refers to the whole range of creatures from the smallest microbes to the largest animals and plants that God created. I would like to just briefly pay tribute to some of way back when I worked in Washington, D.C., I went to the Sligo SDA Church and got to know very personally Roy Branson, so it's a privilege to speak, and also know another classroom attendant, Gil Burnham, many of you may know, who's still at the School of Public Health in Johns Hopkins. Ron and Roy, Branson and I had many interesting discussions. We participated in things like the Million Man March and various events after 9/11 and the Iraq War and so on. So it's a privilege to be in this class today. Now, I'm going to present in really two parts. I must first say that I'm not a philosopher, so or a theologian. I've dabbled in both. So David, you will have to catch me on where I trip up here on these things. The first part, I'm going to focus more on my, shall we say, my modernist self. That is my life as a geoscientist, the life of the mind, focusing on science, on region, on facts, natural law, authority, process, systems, things of that nature, but particularly focused on what our responsibilities and culpabilities are regards God's creation, nature. And we may want to discuss words like stewardship, creation care. What does that mean? And then toward the end, as a brief, some of you may know, if you follow me on Facebook or on Instagram, that I've become, my life now is focused around photography. As a landscape artist, a photographer, my sister is an artist. And so there's a part of me that I say it's my postmodernist self, okay, that looks at life and humanity, focusing on things hopefully like beauty, feeling, touch, vision, empathy, instinct, aesthetics, place, and trying to understand our place in the world, in community and culture and landscape. And I want to, we'll go through some scientific facts, but before I begin, I want to tell a little story that's from this picture that I took a few years ago. This was in one of my last consulting trips to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I was part of a team that was helping to rebuild the wardens and the people that were protecting two of the oldest national parks in Africa, Kundalungu and Upemba National Park. And it was near sundown that I took this picture. In fact, the sun set 5 minutes after this. And I keep coming back to this picture. To me, it kind of embodies a lot of the issues that we're going to deal with. Now, I'll ask you later when we in our discussion to tell me what you think you see here. Okay? You can take a look at this picture and you think, oh, what a beautiful afternoon on the savannah. There's the track. We can see the imprint of humans as they've gone across the track there numerous times looking for wildlife. And you say, wow, that's God's at his best. That's nature at his best. It's beautiful. How many would agree with that? Maybe you can raise your hands and say, no, you don't have to critique my photography skills or whatever, but it was a beautiful moment, a beautiful picture. But let me ask a question. What's missing here? Think about that a little bit. What's missing? Some of you may have been here, may know, and I'll come back to it in a little bit more detail. But what's missing is that 25 or 30 years ago, there were over 10 to 15,000 elephants on this savanna. There were maybe 30,000 various kinds of gazelle and impalas and other animals. It was alive with creatures. Today in this park, there are less than 300 elephants left. The day before, I got to go see the last of 35 zebra, only 35 zebra left in this park. This park is the size of Connecticut, okay? Huge area, 35 zebra that's left. Now, and so to me, this kind of epitomizes where we are. There's a lot of things happening that are unseen in our world, and we kind of go along. We think everything's fine, but there's a lot that's happening. Let's review some of the facts and the trends that are happening from a scientific perspective. Of course, we've all heard, climate change is going to lead to the disappearance of several nations. Global biodiversity is killing off creatures, destroying rainforests. There's many different things that are happening. And there is some of you, I asked, I don't know, in the message that you sent out, I asked if those of you that are really interested would look at the recent YouTube presentation by David Attenborough. This is someone that I've followed all my life. His life, in many respects, mirrors some of my work over the years, although he is much better known and so on. And so I would encourage you after Sabbath school to go back and look at it if you haven't. If we have time, we could go back and look at the little preview. There's about a 5-minute preview that I could go on, but I don't want to maybe take the time right now. But basically, let's review some of the trends that are happening in the world and then talk about that. Climate change, of course, is one of the big issues that we hear a lot about, a lot of it is caused by humans. That's what we mean by anthropogenic. There are many natural forces as well that are influencing, how the climate changes. But most scientists today agree that the influence of humans is by far the dominant factor. And so that's what we want to look at today. The consequences of climate change are leading to warmer temperatures. I'll talk briefly about what's happening around my place right here. Melting ice caps, rising sea levels, extreme events, and I'm going to talk about some of those. Now, the impacts can be both positive and negative. There are always winners and losers in these major global changes. And so we want to remember a little bit about that as well. Just about 99% of scientists agree that the next 30 years is going to be critical. And how we as humans behave, what we do toward increasing resilience and sustainability is going to be a real critical problem. The story, for those of you that want to pursue the science facts in more detail, I'll quickly go through some of the key places. And I think, David, if I recall, you did send out a listing of some websites and resources that I've put together. And I'll refer to some of them at the end. I encourage you to go look at some of the sources. NASA is one of the more important ones. One of the most important measures, of course, is what's happening in our atmosphere. Irrespective of what you may feel about the age of the Earth, if you go back in time looking at measures in the oceans, measures in the atmosphere, what's been happening since 1950, the early 1900s to now, is really way beyond any kind of geological or human experience. So we are really facing major changes in the nature of the environment. What is that doing? Now, this is a satellite image just from about 3 months ago. And this is the Arctic. And if you will notice that the Arctic ice sheet is literally, disappearing completely. It's the lowest it's been in millennia. Now, I mentioned that there's both positive and negative impacts of that. Geopolitics is being influenced. China is now developing, because the ice is free most of the year, they're developing a new routes for shipping and trade with Europe that will go around the ice sheets to the north and cut off the distance that goods have to travel to reach the European market by thousands and thousands of miles. This, of course, increases and lowers the price China is also building a massive road and belt initiative across Central Asia, corresponding with what many of us know as the old Silk Route. And of course, these trade and geopolitical relationships are going to change the politics and commerce of the world in the next few years. And there will be winners and losers from that as well. And of course, even for the United States, now you will be able to go ice-free shipping all the way around to Alaska to New York, much shorter distance than going down through the Panama Canal and around. But so the changes in climate, what it's going to do to the oceans, to the ice caps and so on is a major thing. But if we look at what's happening in nature itself, biodiversity, you know, there's just so much happening in terms of rainforest destruction, overfishing, coral reef destruction, the rise of new diseases. And I think that all of us on a global scale experiencing COVID-19 are suddenly becoming aware of what happens when, quotes, new diseases come out of the forest somewhere and then come into the human population. Now this isn't the only time this has happened, but it's increasing at a significant level. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Some of you may want to go back later and look at some of these sources. One of the major sources on biodiversity loss, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is based in Gland, Switzerland. It's just about 10 blocks from the Adnes Hospital in Gland that was built very early, one of the center of Swiss Adventism. And I've visited both institutions several times. And they track how species are appearing or disappearing in the world. Another index that is useful to follow in terms of what's happening in the world is what's called the Living Planet Index from the World Wildlife Fund. And they measure changes that are really quite startling in an amazing way. And I'm going to just, I just brought a few visuals in here just to kind of describe what's happening and what are the major losses. Climate change only accounts for about 6% of the loss of vertebrate species. This was between 1970 and 2016. That's significant, but not the largest. But even more important, if you go up and you look at invasive species and diseases, and then whether it's affecting the food systems or whether it's affecting the oceans or the land, it's up about 13%. Pollution, of course, is having an impact as well on fisheries and things. But the biggest impact on species loss is really the land use change and sea use change, how we use the landscape. David Attenborough points out, if you looked at his recent Netflix, that literally half of the earth now is being used and consumed by humans. There's only a half of it that's in a semi-natural state, but that's degrading every day. And that's where, of course, we do the logging, where we get our housing, where our cities are built, where we do agriculture. And that's really the biggest change and the biggest area of concern. Now, where are most of these losses occurring is also a concern. If you look at this graph again, if you want to go back later and explore some of these sites, I encourage you. But Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been a 94% decline in some of the key species in Latin America and the Caribbean. Europe and Central Asia is only about 24%, but Africa is very high. And I'm going to focus today primarily on Africa and Latin America to give you some examples from work that I've done to show you some of these changes. So, so the biggest threat to land use to biodiversity. It's really overexploitation of species, changes in land and sea use, and so on. Okay, let me just, I'm going to spend a little time now just talking about my life and my experience of observing some of these systems, and from different parts of the world. I'm privileged today to see J.C. Billiard on. He went on some of our trips back when he was a student, and so on. So he may remember some of this. Let's talk a little bit about it. Because as one of the consequences of climate change is that we're seeing hurricanes, which are not new, and typhoons, but they are more frequent and they're intensifying. And if, for those of you that have a little bit of scientific interest, if you look in the bottom right of this graph, it shows 3 of the most recent hurricanes, Delta, Eta, and Iota. And you might notice that those names are Greek alphabet. Okay, what happened is that this year, for the first time in a long time, we ran out of the normal names that are used for hurricanes, and we had to start using the Greek alphabet. Now that's in itself is kind of interesting, but notice even more, if you see where those dots are, it shows that the wind strength and the ferocity of these storms. This is late in the season, October to November, when usually the hurricane season is going down, and they actually intensified. So the warm oceans are leading to increased problems. In fact, this is just from a few weeks ago, November 20. Some of you may, there was so much else going on in the news, a lot of people didn't follow what's happening in Central America. I've been under this bridge here. You can see refugees trying to flee the floods and the hurricanes and so on. This is in Honduras, where I was born and raised as a child. What we're looking at here is, and again, this is a very great essay. I encourage you folks to go and look at it. I have a link on the page. It's a photo essay of what a phenomena that we're going to hear more and more about. It's called climate refugees. Not all refugees are driven by failures in their crop systems or land degradation, but a lot of it, and it's increasing. Particularly from Central America, the Northern Triangle, places like El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. This is, for those that are concerned about immigration as an issue, this is just the beginning. It's going to get worse. This is what we need to be prepared for. Many years ago, I was privileged to travel across Central Asia by land, all the way on the Silk Route from Beijing to Central Asia with the National Geographic. And we were able to observe some of the changes that occurred on landscape and climate in that region. I spent 3 months at Adnas University, or I guess a university now, it's a small college then, in Pakistan, to observe some of the changes that are happening in that part of the world. And then many years ago, when I taught at Loma Linda, we led a team in the Pacific Islands, particularly in the Marshall Islands, studying the impacts of the atomic testing of the 50s and 60s on the health. And of course, that it was a big concern. But what's happening now in terms of climate is, it's leading to the fact that some of these nations literally will disappear off of the map. Now, I don't have time to go into a whole geography lesson of what creates atolls and islands and so on, but these islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, some of them will start, as volcanic islands, and then they gradually erode. It develops a series of reefs. And then you get these offshore reefs, and then eventually you get an atoll, which literally the volcano is underwater and dead, and then you have these fringing reefs and lagoons. Beautiful places to go skin diving and so on. Now, these are some pictures from that I took from the Marshall Islands a few years back, and they were already beginning to experience some of the impacts of ocean level, the oceans rising and other changes. Reefs begin to die off, and so if you look in the middle top here, you can see these beautiful corals that have color, and then they die and they become skeletons. And of course, the reefs themselves start to degrade. And as the oceans rise, the little bit of source for fresh water disappears, the wells go saline, and eventually, with the changes in rainfall patterns, people have to emigrate. And so right now, as we speak, one of the biggest migrations in history is people from the Pacific Islands having to find new places to live. They're coming to America, they're going to Australia, elsewhere. This is a picture from the Marshall Islands of a few years back. This is what happens to a dead reef as it degrades and then gets washed up on shore or eroded away. So there are things happening and we need to be aware of them. Let's focus a little bit on Latin America, and this is where JC, I don't know, you may find yourself in one of these pictures or not. Over the years that I was at Loma Linda, but also at Westminster College and at Utah State, I led several study tours through Latin America, and frequently went to evaluate projects for ADRA in Latin America, but also in Africa. And one of the places that we went to, I just have several pictures here. In the bottom middle, this was one of the earlier groups I took from Loma Linda, and we visited Belize, and we visited a project run by a gentleman that used to run a TV show that many Southern Californians probably know. It was called The Galloping Gourmet. I don't know if any of you remember The Galloping Gourmet. He ran a cooking show on television. It was a big thing back here 20, 30 years ago. And he eventually decided he's going to try to deal with famine, and he went and set up a small program in Belize to help people that were affected by Hurricane Hattie. And to the left of that is a picture of some of the damage from Hurricane Hattie. My parents' home is in the background there, and they now have a sailing boat sitting in their backyard. And over the years, I've taken several trips back to Central America, students. I should point out in the middle picture here, here's Stephen Dunbar, who's a professor of biology at Loma Linda. I took him on his first trip down to Central America, and he's been going back ever since, studying biological changes in some of the coastal wetlands of Central America. There's a lot happening. And just a few pictures just to show you some of the things. Where the three countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua come together, there's a famous bay. It's called the Gulf of Fonseca. This is the largest wetlands and mangrove swamp anywhere between North America and South America. And it's the normal place where literally millions of birds that fly back and forth with the season stop off to live and to eat as they're flying down to South America and then back north. Over the last 20, 30 years, many of these mangroves have been cut back, and they've been turned into saline ponds where they evaporate to create rock salt. So when you buy rock salt, in Whole Foods or in Clark's there in Loma Linda or whatever, you could be getting some rock salt from what used to be former mangrove swamp area, and with all the degradation that's going along with it. I'm gonna, as I mentioned, I was privileged to, over the years, to spend several trips going with ADRA, observing what they're doing in places up here in the middle, the lady with the young child. This was a refugee coming in from Mozambique that had come into Malawi, to Malamulo, where Gil Burnham was. On the left, we're looking at agricultural change in the Altiplano of Peru. There's another picture here of drying up fields. That was in Guatemala. So we could spend considerable time talking about some of the places that I've gone either on research or taking students. I spent 4 years, after I had worked at Loma Linda in the 80s and into the early 90s. I went to work for the State Department and USAID, and was brought in to work on a major hurricane that had ravaged Haiti, Hurricane George. Some of you may have remembered Hurricane George. And here you see some of the middle picture is some of the damage on the slopes in Hurricane, below an ancient fort built in the 1800s during the Haitian Revolution. And on the right, we see some of the agricultural innovations that we were trying to introduce to reduce the impacts. Later on, I spent time as a Fulbright scholar in Honduras in the biology department, spent a year there. We had an El Nino. Some of you may know that El Ninos and La Ninas, these are another climate phenomena that they're natural, they're normal, but they have increased in their ferocity with climate change. And you can see again some pictures of some of the damage from those trips. On some of those trips, a very close friend of mine who I was sad that we lost a few years ago was Charlie Teal. Many of you, Charlie Teal went with me on one of my first trips, and it's got him started, and he spent the rest of his career working in Latin America. So I want to pay tribute to him. Also, Doug Havens, who used to teach agriculture at Loma Linda, went to work for ADRA. So what pulls together a lot of this is that when you experience firsthand and see the effects of what nature can do, the damage over your lifetime, and when you see it getting worse over your lifetime, you begin to realize that there is something going on just more than normal. And I think that's the key message that we want to look at. So that was kind of my wake-up call as I worked in Latin America. I want to go back a little bit to also work in Africa. When I did my PhD, I originally was going to study medical anthropology, medical geography. I think, JC, you've taken some classes in that area. And I got intrigued by geography, and I went in to study what are called farming systems. And I ended up getting a grant to go to Africa, West Africa, during the Great Sahelian Drought, which in the 1970s to the early 1980s. And I was part of a team that helped us set up one of the more important, I think, innovations that our government has ever done. It's called the Famine Early Warning System. And this is a system that keeps track of both social and economic data, but also satellite imagery, and it keeps track of what's happening around the world so that we can get ahead of major disasters. And as a result, we've not had a major climate-related disaster, I would say, since the 1980s because of this system. We have a lot of conflict related to politics and other things creating refugees, but actual famine, it's really decreasing. Just a few pictures from the 3 years I was working in West Africa, looking at the Sahel drought. You can see some of the damage here. It was really quite impressive. I keep track with some of the villagers and the people that I worked with back in those years. Later, I came back to Loma Linda, worked a few years, and then I ended up going to East Africa and was part of a small team with Elton Wallace. Some of you may know Elton Wallace, who was at PUC many years. We started the Adnas University of Central Africa. We were there from 99 to about 2004. And excuse me, I'm getting my dates wrong. This would be 1984 to 88. When we started out with 25 students, The university, Adventist University of Central Africa, has over 7,000 students now, and Loma Linda is now helping to establish the first Adventist medical school at that university now, which is really a great progress. During those years, I went back also to work with other universities. I worked with ADRA, but I went as a senior advisor to the a research institute at the National University of Rwanda. This was in 2009 to 10. And then over those years, I both from the early years when I was at the Adventist University and then later at the National University, we got to know of the work of the Dian Fossey Fund. In fact, Dian Fossey, if you've ever seen the film Gorillas in the Mist, it's really an impressive one. Her best friend just lived down the road, a mile away from our Adventist campus, and we got to meet her and her friend and get to know her. We were actually in Rwanda at the time that she was killed, which was really, that's another whole story in itself, which is worth discussing. And I learned other things there that I think are important for us to understand. One of the more important issues that's happening as we destroy our, shall we say, our natural habitat to build agriculture, we create landscapes like this. And if you look at this picture, this shows the line, the dividing line between the forest to the left. This is in the Virunga National Park, and to the right, you see encroaching agriculture right up to the edge of the park. And if you look at the picture in the bottom right, here is a mountain gorilla coming out to have some corn and maize and beans. He learns to like, and of course, there's a cow right there up in the upper part of the picture. And then part of the picture you don't see, there was a farmer hoeing his field. Now this is one of the classic ways that new diseases come out of the forest and get into humans, or vice versa. Human diseases can, the gorillas and chimpanzee, they get the same diseases we do. They get colds, they get flus, they get influenza. And so how we are literally looking at tremendous impacts on human. During those years that I was in Rwanda, I helped to write an article, and this, when I go back to a book that some of you may have read a few years ago. Jared Diamond was really a very well-known writer, and he wrote one of the more important books he called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And one of his case studies was Rwanda. Of course, Rwanda is the country with the highest population density in all of Africa. And of course, he tried to make the case that there's a direct link between overpopulation and then genocide, which occurred in Rwanda, which was a very sad thing. Now, I spent some time writing an article, a chapter in a book, looking at how humans actually cope with extreme land pressures, and tried to show, as usual, I'm not going to go into the details, the technical details, but the bottom line is that if you look at vulnerability in the broadest sense, it really is a very complex picture that includes politics, of course, it includes exposure, class, political economy, natural environment. It's a very complex situation. And so as we look at this whole issue of how humans react and interact with nature, I want you to come away with the major lesson is that it's a complex story. It's not just population, it's not just consumption, it's not just climate, it's not just overfishing or poaching or whatever. It's a complex interaction, and it also has to do with how we as humans interact with each other. Now, if some of you are interested in this story about the mountain gorilla and what's happening there, what we've learned over 40 years, there's a wonderful Netflix film called Virunga. I encourage you to go look at that. Now, let's talk a little bit about what what humans have tried to do. And when I went to work for the State Department back in 1999 to 2004, I was brought in both to work on the hurricane problems in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but also became part of the climate team. And the climate change team was trying to look at that and what we can do to reduce emissions and to improve. And so that was my major goal. And I spent 4 years, interesting experience, started under the Bush administration, under the Clinton administration, and ended up working under the Bush administration as well. Are we making progress? Let's talk about it. Are we doing any better about how we deal with the environment? Now, there are some good signs. Here in the Southwest, for those of you that follow what happens on the Colorado River, as you know, the Colorado River for many years didn't even reach the Gulf of Sea of Cortez. It wouldn't even reach into Mexico. But after treaties and work, you can see here's a change in wetlands down in Mexico, down near the mouth of the Colorado River, where bird life is now coming back. So there are some improvements that have happened. In the 4 years that I worked at the USAID, I was involved with several of the international meetings dealing with climate change, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity. I led an initiative, this is kind of technical details, that was jointly funded by ESRI, which is in Redlands, those of you know ESRI, and the State Department and the National Academy of Sciences. And it was a very interesting project called My Community, Our Earth. And it tried to focus on helping children understand their linkages to the environment. I ended up at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, helped to develop a booth that I ran there for a month, helped write the talking points for Colin Powell when he made his speech at the World Summit. And if you want to go listen to his speech, which was kind of controversial at the time, you can click on this later and go listen to his speech. I skipped forward here a little bit. So for the next year and a half, I and other colleagues from the USGS ran a series of workshops across Africa, trying to improve abilities to monitor changes in climate. Some of the more interesting projects that we funded was looking at how malaria and Rift Valley fever, schistosomiasis, and Ebola, how they are enhanced, or shall we say mitigated, by good public health practice. And of course, that could be expanded to what we've learned over H1N1 or the COVID-19 now. Because as climate has changed in East Africa, for instance, the climates have moved upslope, the mosquitoes have become more prevalent, move upslope. So former areas in East Africa that used to be mosquito-free are now not. And so we have to deal with those changes. One of the programs that we funded was as well trying to protect endangered species like the gorilla. But a more interesting activity that we were involved with is something that very few people know about, but I think it's one of the things that our government does spend money on that is worth knowing and it's worth. And that is around the world, if you look at the map to the right, this lists some of what are called the international research, this consultative group on international agricultural research. These are centers for agricultural research that came out of what was known 30, 40 years ago as the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution really staved off famine and disaster because of their ability to improve agriculture. And so one of the major things that we do with our foreign policy money is to support some of these centers. And they specialize in all different kinds of crops and places, from rice, the International Rice Research Institute, the Wheat and Maize Institute in Mexico, the International Water Management Institute in Hyderabad, other things. And one of my jobs was to be a liaison to some of these centers. These centers, even under the Trump administration, and I'm not trying to be political, but even under them, they continue to do very good work. Specialists that try to deal with some of the impacts on agriculture and food around the world. One of the projects that I helped to support and manage while I was in Washington was a project dealing with smallholder cacao and coffee producers around the world, and particularly in areas where the coffee producers also protected the land by creating habitat for birds. And so this was something we did with the Smithsonian Institute. The Smithsonian Institute at the time, or institution, had a program called Bird Friendly Coffee. And it was a way of trying to help small farmers make a living by coffee, but at the same time protecting the natural rainforest that was shading their coffee, instead of introducing hybrid coffee that was really dangerous to the landscape. A very interesting project, and it was a privilege to travel around the world. Okay, just a few more comments here about some recent experiences. I live up near Zion National Park. This is our place. This is about 7 years ago when we had a big snow. And this was the first big snow we had ever had in about 25 years that we've had land up here. And the old timers told me, oh, well, we haven't had snows like this in 30 years. And there we had it. It was the first time I had to clear my driveway to get out. It was a beautiful experience. Since then, we've been in a drought. And if you've been following what's happening in our region of the world, I was encouraged to run for county commissioner here 2 years ago. And we had forums all around our county in southern Utah to look at. And one of the big issues that was debated was what's happening to fire. And of course, if you live in California, you know about fire. I served for a couple of years on the Zion Corridor Fire and EMT Board, got well aware of some of the risk issues around fire. But the biggest issue is what's happening to water in the Southwest. This is a picture of Lake Powell right now. This is where our water comes from in our region. And if you look at that big line, this is where the water was 30 years ago, and it's haven't been there since. It's gone way down, and big debates over what the future of water. We are facing, as I said, since our last big snow a few years ago, we've been in drought. And this drought could be going on for many years. This is what the drought monitor map looked like just in September of this year. The scientists are telling us that much of the U.S. Midwest we're moving toward major water crisis over the years. And a lot, of course, this is linked to climate change. In recent years, I also spent a little bit of time doing some consulting in Abu Dhabi, the Persian Gulf. There, they are also seeing similar major changes: reef degradation, fisheries decline, mangrove dieback, and so on. So the whole world is, shall we say, in many respects, is going through changes of many different kinds. In 2010, I went back to fill in as an interim director for the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund in the Congo. And this was really a very satisfying experience to help to rescue small Grauer gorillas and return them to a sanctuary. UN peacekeepers helped to transport them. This was in an area that was going through a lot of human conflict as well. And then from 2010 to 2014, I've made 2 or 3 trips, short trips back to do consulting in the Congo, as I mentioned earlier. And here to see some of the impacts that are happening on national parks and what used to be very beautiful, pristine areas is really quite traumatizing. Top right here, you see this what looks like gold mining. This was actually digging for sand by people that are trying to, they cart it off. This is in the national park, carting it off to the city of Lubumbashi, a city of several million people now, and the need for, and at the bottom we have charcoal that is being collected illegally. We used a series, as you know, I'm a geographer. We used a series of maps to create threat maps to look at where are the areas that are the most danger from environmental degradation. And as you might suspect, it's along the highways. So very interesting. This is a satellite image from Lake Upemba in the Congo. Very interesting. When I first saw this, I couldn't believe what it is. And it turns out, if you follow each one of these little curlicues right to the center of the curlicue, and you would find an illegal fish trap, okay, where they're collecting fish. And these are supposed to be protected lakes. There's also gold mining. There's insurgencies. Some of the insurgencies that are going on in places like Congo and Sudan and so on are driven by poaching and smuggling, but a lot of it is driven by trying to stabilize the government. But again, the natural environment is suffering many of the consequences. Okay, I'm going to skip forward here a little bit. Here's a picture of a truckload of charcoal coming out of the national park. And I just stood right by the road, took pictures of, in an hour, there were at least 5 trucks loaded like this that came out of the national park heading to Lubumbashi to sell illegal charcoal. People that are hungry will go wherever they need to. These are small families that have moved into the national park. These are some of the illegal fish traps that we found in the park. A lot's happening. In the top right here is a picture of some of the 35 remaining zebra that are left in the park. They're about 50 now, but they have to be guarded, 24-hour armed guard to keep the last of the zebra from disappearing in this park. And what was amazing to me is during the months that I was there on this particular project, we go into the schools in the city of Lubumbashi and we talk to the students about conservation and things like that. And most of them had never even heard of the national park. I asked all of the kids in this picture, had they ever seen an elephant or a gorilla or a zebra, or none of them had ever seen that. And here I am, a foreigner, comes in as a consultant, and I can go and see the wildlife. So how do we look at nature in the future? Now, why do people deny that a lot of this is happening? And this is where I want to get into the core of our discussion here. There are many explanations for it. Why do people deny climate change, or why do they deny that the land is degrading? There was an interesting book a few years ago by Michael Spector, in which he talks about, he mentions how that for centuries, coming out of the Enlightenment, we have come to accept that science and facts teach us things that are true, that are important. But in recent years, we've seen the research by pharmaceutical companies, or whether it's research around agriculture being attacked for various reasons. And just to quote here a little bit, as Michael Spector sees it, this amounts to a war against progress. The issues may be complex, but the choices are not. Are we going to continue to embrace new technologies along with acknowledging their limitations and threats, or are we ready to slink back into an era of magical thinking? And he calls for what he says is a new enlightenment. We need to rediscover what the Enlightenment was about and then to rediscover it for today. Here's another article that just came out here actually about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, December 18, written by, this came out as an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail in England. Dave Kurshen is an Indian activist along with another science writer, and they talk about the need to, in the title really attracted me. He says, the real cure for COVID is to renew our fractured relationship with the planet. We need to rediscover that we are part of nature, and we're not just dominions of nature or consumers of nature. So that it was an interesting article, and you may want to go and look at that. A close friend of mine, who's actually the elder of our church here in St. George, is a geologist, and he studied under an earth scientist at the University of Toronto, Sean B. Carroll. And he recently wrote this article. This is November 8, 2020, very recent, in which he looks again at the whole debate around evolution and vaccines and the rejection of science and how it has happened both in the past, whether it was back in the time of Galileo or whether it's up to the modern time. And there's been this constant struggle between the deniers and those that understand the role of science in the world. Now, there are other explanations. This article here I saw, I think, is illustrative. This goes back to, some of you remember the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there is an excellent writer, a lady by the name of Naomi Klein, who looks at the relationship between climate change and capitalism. And she makes the case, and then others have made the case, that really the culprit we're talking about here is capitalism, and that the only way is to move beyond the underlying values of capitalism, which she sees as greed and individualism. And this extreme greed and individualism, the lack of understanding of how we need to interact as humans, is really an important one. So there's that explanation. But what are the implications for Christians? Okay, how do we as Christians, how should we look at this whole issue of environmental degradation, of climate change? There are, now, a couple of weeks ago, and David, I want you to comment on this. You've made several presentations about the natural and human law and God's law, about Thomas Aquinas. I was particularly attracted by how Thomas Aquinas looked at some of these issues. And how do we look at that today? I mean, what, and then how does it relate to pre and postmodernism? These are interesting philosophical discussions, but I think we really need to get down to the nuts and bolts of what is driving this, and what does religion have to do with it, if any. Now, the other day, David sent you these links on a very important author of back in 1967, Lynn White, wrote this wonderful article, and Dave, I want you to comment about this. And he listed other sites about the relationship between Christianity and the global ecological crisis. Of course, Lynn White tries to make the case that Christianity in many respects is the cause of it. Now, he's not, we may want to discuss that. Now, I looked at some of this, and maybe it's because of my travels around the world. I don't agree with Lynn completely that Christianity is to blame for all of this. If you look at major world religions throughout history, if you go back to the Maya in the Yucatan, or the Incas in South America. If you go to South Asia, you look at, go back to the Nile kingdoms. It seems that humans have had a proclivity to expand and to create bureaucracies and to create unequal types of societies that eventually both, some of them collapse. But in one of the underlying characteristics of all of them has been being rather rapacious toward nature. So the idea that Christians are the only ones who don't treat nature correctly, I think, is probably a little simplistic. But let's discuss that here in the next few minutes. Now, there's a lady that I follow quite closely. She is professor and co-director of the Climate Center at Texas Tech University, Catherine Hayhoe. She's been listed by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world today. And she's had a lot to say about climate, and particularly she's an evangelical Christian. We could listen if we have time. We can go and listen to a little bit of what she has to say. It's very good, but I want to first make sure that we have time to discuss a little bit, and we can always go back. I'll just summarize what she says, and this really fits my view of the world in many respects. And she says, I'm a climate scientist. I'm also an evangelical Christian, and I'm a Canadian, okay? And which is why it took me so long to realize that the first things were supposed to be entirely incompatible. Okay, I guess you can't be a Canadian and a scientist or a Christian. But anyway, she said, I grew up in a Christian family with a science teacher dad who taught us that science is the study of God's creation. If we truly believe that God created the universe amazing with energy and life out of formless, empty void of nothing, then how could studying his creation be in conflict with his word? And I think that's what we want to discuss about. She says, I chose to study precisely because my faith, because climate change disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, those already most at risk today. And that's what Jesus was about. It was about who were the vulnerable, who were the most affected. Now, I at the bottom, I have links to another gentleman. This is a Seventh-day Adventist theologian. He studied at Andrews University. He's from Korea. I think he's back in Korea. And he wrote a very interesting article in the Journal of Applied Christian Leadership. I encourage you to go back and look at him. What he has to say about creation care, about our relationship to nature. Of course, one of the more better known, shall we say, religious theological writings about our relationship with nature is the encyclical by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, in which he asks humans to look at our commitment to both the poor and the vulnerable and to nature. And there's a very beautiful little video that you can, if you go and click on this, again, I don't want to maybe spend time on this, but you can go and look at it. This is from the Cardinal of Honduras, okay? This is where I grew up and was raised, where I went back as a Fulbright scholar. And if I recall correctly, I think I may have met him at one of the embassy meetings there in the country. And he makes a very strong case for the reason Christians in general, not just Catholics, but Christians in general, should be concerned about the environment. And then he references Pope Francis and thing. And he has a prayer that I would like to briefly propose. I don't know if we'll have time. We might want to go back and read this, maybe sometime as a liturgy, maybe next week we could do it. But it really, I think, creates some very interesting things. Now, I know that for some Adventists, quoting something from the Pope is anathema, so please don't throw me out for doing that. But I believe that, we need to look at this in a very broad way. There has also been a very good statement from our own General Conference about our relationship with nature and what we should do about it. So it's not just Pope Francis, but our own church has said, but, words are just words. What are we actually doing about it? Now, there are some Christians, including Adventists, that are actually working very strongly, and I think Dave sent out a list of some of these resources with web links. There's a whole creation care movement that's developed, this evangelical environmental network, which does a lot of work among the evangelicals. There are other, non-sectarian groups that are involved with what to do and what to get involved with. So I've created some links for all of you to look at. Okay, for the last 5 minutes, I just want to put on my postmodernist hat. Okay, Dave. Okay, and you'll tell me if this is true postmodernism or not. Maybe I'm dreaming here, but as you know, I live on a small little ranch up near Zion National Park. This picture of the peaks are what I take out. I took this a few years ago right out of my back door, and so I now make my living either consulting, but living on this little small ranch where I raise hay for horses, and we have half of the land is now in a conservation easement. We're returning it to nature. There's a lot of beautiful places. I do fine art photography. A lot of my photography focuses on a term that some of you may not have ever heard of before. It's called geotourism. Now, this is a philosophy that comes out of the National Geographic Society, and I'll just quote here. It says, geotourism is tourism that sustains or enhances the geographical character of a place, its environment, its culture, aesthetics, heritage, and the well-being of its residents. And so it's really about, and also using the revenue from conservation to protect the history, the culture, and the place, distinctive places in our world, our heritage. And so that's kind of what I do these days. I take a lot of pictures locally, but also pictures from around the world. And this is kind of, I think it brings out, again, Dave, you're going to have to tell me whether this is my postmodernist self or whether I'm dreaming here or not. But it's not my scientific hat, but it's my love of beauty, of nature, and so on. But also, as a geographer, a love of place and of people and of culture. And how do we, now this is very traditional Southern Utah, Mormon Utah, with the St. George Tabernacle. Or we're looking at the Great Wall. This is the end of the Great Wall in China or in Australia. This is from Canada, Southern California, Northern California, Sonoma Valley, South and Central America. So just a few pictures from some of my travels and my trying to better understand and preserve what we humans have done. Some of it very good, and of course some of it is not very good. So just some of the beauties that we can still find. This is in England on the left, and on the right, the famous Keukenhof Gardens of the Netherlands in spring, which is always a beautiful place to visit. Geneva, Switzerland, and on the left, St. Petersburg, Russia. My daughter-in-law is from St. Petersburg, and we got to visit her family. So getting to know her family in Russia and what they've gone through. I think I mentioned earlier in the discussion, my son and daughter-in-law They live in Switzerland now. We go visit them periodically, not far from the Alps or France and so on. So thank you. I should just mention that in many respects, I'm following in the footsteps of my grandparents. Some of you mentioned earlier the book, These Fords Still Run. These were grandparents. And it goes way back, and I was just recalling, in the top left here, this is my grandfather with his father, my great-grandfather, when he was 15 years old, I guess it was. And he went with him to Cuba in 1912. My great-grandfather thought he was going to be a self-supporting colporteur. And he went to Cuba, and this was, of course, after Teddy Roosevelt had been there and all of his shenanigans, and figured out he couldn't learn Spanish very well, and so he gave up, and they came back. Then my grandfather went to Walla Walla, became a missionary, and spent the rest of his life in Latin America. And then, of course, my parents followed in their footsteps. This is, I hate to say, this was me as a baby, okay, on my parents' first home in the Bay Islands of Honduras, and so on. So in many respects, at least I feel like what I'm doing is following the footsteps of what my ancestors have done, both as an Adventist and as a Christian, but also as a scientist. I think I spent many summers with my grandfather, and I always thought that he was, he loved being a missionary and a pastor, but what he really enjoyed was nature. And he loved studying nature out of doors. When they came back to the States in 1930 on furlough, they took the long way. They went over the mountains from Ecuador, over the Andes, down to the Amazon, and went down by boat all the way to the Amazon and eventually to New York. And they brought with them several hundred specimens of butterflies and all kinds of animals and things that they had collected in the Amazon jungle in the 1929-30. And it's still in the basement, I understand, this stuff that he brought back of the Museum of Natural History in New York. And I asked my grandfather about that once, and he said that was his most exciting time of life, is spending that time going down the Amazon, seeing what nature was truly like, and so on. So anyway, that's my initial presentation. I'll stop the sharing here now, and we'll see, go into our discussion, and you, Dave, you can lead us to wherever you want to go here.
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you, Bob. Thank you for this presentation, but thank you for your life.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
We maybe I can just add one thing. Your father and my father were the best of friends at Walla Walla.
Right, and I think your dad was my dad's best man at his wedding. I
think so, something like that. And I could not help but think that how happy they would be, how proud they would be of you, your father and my father. Yes, both. Yeah. So let's take all the time we need. If we will take as much of Bob Ford's time as we can get now. If we don't get it all done, we'll invite him back subsequently. We have him next week for sure. The third week of that is open. If he can make it, great. If he can't, we'll do something else and get him rescheduled subsequently. But now we need to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to make just a couple of quick comments about what Bob said to me. It won't take long, but then let's get to some questions. I hope that we will begin our questions with trying to understand things, that is, factual questions. Let's try to understand the situation as clearly and as precisely as we can. And then after that, we can in a more relaxed way, think about not only what is the case, but what ought to be the case. So that's about where we are. It looks to me like it's about 11:51 in California. Maybe we can start again about 12 o'clock, something like that, take 9 or 10 minutes, a little bit afternoon. Let's all go and stretch have something good to drink that will refresh us, and we'll start up here in just about 10 minutes.
Of the Katanga Region National Park Service was in cahoots with the poachers, selling ivory and other things on international networks. He got, luckily they found out and they took him to the International Criminal Courts. But it turns out that some of his family were probably the ones that assassinated the head of the Park Service there that we were working with. And so it's a dangerous place. I live up here near Zion, and I'm so thankful that the rangers up here don't have to worry about being assassinated like they do there in the Congo.
Well, thank you, Bob. Forrest is back, and so we can get started. Forrest has the cue as to who is going to speak. Maybe I can say a couple of words just here at the outset.
First, David, I haven't got anybody up yet, so just encourage people to raise their hand and I'll be watching for it.
Okay, so I'll make some comments. My first comment is to thank the class for its support of Restore a Child. I had hoped that our class could contribute $1,000, and we agreed that people would contribute individually rather than through the class. And you folk have given many multiples of that, many multiples of that. And I only know about some of it. So when I say many, I don't mean 10 or 20, I mean more than that. So thank you very much. Secondly, I really like the idea of a new enlightenment. I am not comfortable with the expression, the failure of the Enlightenment, or the failure of the so-called Enlightenment. That has become very stylish in some academic circles, actually many academic circles, to be, I think, unduly negative about the Enlightenment. We need not to return to the Enlightenment as it was, but to move forward and upgrade it and make it possible to continue the Enlightenment values, albeit in ways that are modified. And I would like to suggest that as we go forward, the new Enlightenment goes along with some forms of postmodernism that I'll try to articulate later on whenever we have a chance. But here are some features that the new Enlightenment should have, I think. One, it should thoroughly reject Cartesian dualism, thoroughly. Secondly, it should reintroduce the idea of final causation. Francis Bacon said we're not going to talk about final causation. That's an expression the ancient Greeks used to think about how an organism has a particular purpose and how it fits into the whole ecological order. What the word final here doesn't mean end, it means purpose. What is the end of my life might mean when did it end, or it might mean what was the purpose of my life. So final causation has to do with that. And Bacon just excluded that, and we have to reintroduce it, I think. Thirdly, we need to ease back on Bacon's language of waging war on the natural world. That metaphor of war against the natural world has not been helpful. Then those of us who are Christians, I think, this would be fourth, we need to take Lynn White's criticism very seriously. I take Bob Ford's observation that this is not exclusively a Christian problem, but it is largely one in the West. And it has to do with the doctrine of the image of God. And so often we have thought of the image of God as being manifest only amongst human beings and not at all in any form of life other than human. And I'll just give you one example from Loma Linda with which many of you are familiar. Jack Provencher often quoted Paul Lehman, who said, "The purpose of Christian ethics is to make and keep human life human." All right? The purpose of Christian ethics is to make and keep human life human. that goes along with the idea that the whole non-human world exists solely for the purpose of human value. Now, if we ask Jack or Dr. Favancha, what about these other animals? He would quickly affirm them. But theoretically, that was where he made his point, theoretically. And I think we should not talk about those things. And we need to start thinking about the expression to make man whole. Well, it has a gender issue there, but also there's an ecological issue. We need to be about healing the nations, but also restoring the natural order. So the human-centeredness of Christianity over the last several hundred years is something we need to be concerned about. Finally, there is something you and I each can do right now. You know, it's hard to know what one can do practically in one's own life, but there is something, and that is to stop, as of today, stop eating ruminant animals. Just stop. These are animals that chew the cud. Sheep, goats, cattle, deer, elk, moose, camels, giraffes. Just stop eating them now. Eating these animals is a major cause of ecological degradation. We don't need to eat them. The reason for being a vegetarian now is not so much for your own personal health, it's for the well-being of the globe. We need no more forests cut down for grazing for cattle so that we can eat at McDonald's. It's just not right. So if you're looking for something practical, you can do, as of the end of Sabbath school today, that's it. Stop eating these animals now and forevermore. Over to Bob Ford.
Can I just comment on that first thing? I mean, that you're absolutely right, Dave, that our proclivity, and one of the main reasons I was hired to work with the Dian Fossey Fund and also on some of these trips is because I came out of public health, and my research going back 40, 50 years has been on what we call farming systems, agriculture and food production. And one of the main things that I was doing as part of my influence of the team was to introduce alternatives to eating wild food, bushmeat, as it's called in much of Africa. And what we were able to do around the edge of these national parks, creating alternative forms of agriculture, alternative forms of food, and then moving toward vegetarianism and so on, I think was really an important thing. And I constantly was asked, well, what's a public health nutritionist anthropologist doing in wildlife management? And that's it, what you were just talking about.
Well, unless somebody raises his or her hand, I'm going to keep preaching on this topic.
I got Daryl Retcher that wants to say something.
Okay, let me just preach a little longer. It has become fashionable in some Adventist circles to think that one is enlightened if one gives up the vegetarianism of one's youth and becomes a liberal, quote unquote, Adventist and eats meat. That's not cool. That's not being liberal. That's not being progressive. That is being regressive at the very time when other people in this world are thinking very seriously about the need to become vegetarians. Some of our brightest people are thinking that they're really liberated because now they are escaping their childhood vegetarianism. So I think we need to be careful about that. That's enough preaching from me for a month. Okay, who's up to bat for us?
Daryl Retcher. Unmute yourself, Daryl.
I'm going a different direction. Though I've been a lifetime vegetarian, so preach it, Dave. On Lynn White's comment, I think I agree with Bob that it's more than just Christians. I think it's a human problem of greed that causes a lot of the abuse to nature and trying to take the rainforest out to farm to make a profit. I think that could be part of the problem.
Well, I agree with you, Daryl. I think, the whole issue of inequality, and who gets what and how we invest our funds and where we shop and how we shop, all of that has to do with our basic human values. I agree with you. There's an interesting book that the other Sabbath school class that I tend to follow, Jim Walter's Sabbath seminars. They're starting to read a book right now, and I think Ron Larson knows this. They're reading a new book. It's called Humankind.
Oh, okay.
And one of the central tenets of the book is to look at common people and how humans interact with each other and with their environment and so on. And it asks a very basic question, and I would like the theologians to answer that. Are humans basically evil? And and of course the Bible, that's one view, is that we're evil and all sinners, and we're just kind of programmed to be destructive and aggressive and consumptive. Or do we also is there a lot of good in humankind? Around the world, I have found many times common people who protected me were good people. They were trying to do the right thing, but maybe the systems that they were working on then led them to do things in unkind, unhelpful ways. So what is it? Let me ask you theologians, are we basically evil and we need structures to kind of keep us in line? Or do we also have in us the ability to reach up, to be kinder, to be better, to think of our neighbors, to think of others? What is it?
Well, I'll jump in there. I see on the screen that there are several people here who are theologically informed, so I hope that they speak up to this issue as well. I would say that the biblical view is that we are mixtures of both good and evil, and we have potentials in both directions, and we should take advantage of that. There is a doctrine called total depravity, which has misled many people to think that Christians believe there's nothing good about them. The expression total depravity does not mean, according to the reformers who used it, it does not mean that there is nothing of value whatsoever in human life. It means that every aspect of human life has been contaminated somewhat by sin. So if we would use modern categories, if we would talk about superego, ego, and id, the doctrine of total depravity means that each one of those has been affected somewhat by sin. Not that they have all been totally obliterated. Now, of course, the ancients did not divide the human brain or the mind in that way. But however you think of the mind of the life of the mind, sin says every aspect of it has been affected somewhat. It does not say that every aspect of it has been totally obliterated, and yet the expression total depravity leaves that impression. And I think that's a source of some of the unduly negative views that people have. That's one response. I don't know if other people, I see Jerry wants to talk about something. I don't know if you want to comment on this first, Jerry?
Oh, I hadn't planned on it, Dave. Are you hearing me all right?
Yes.
Well, no, first of all, let me just agree with you. Although if the doctrine of total depravity goes too far in one direction, as often interpreted, the doctrine of total perfection might go too far the other direction. And since you've been talking with us about John Wesley, we might take a moment to ponder the notion of second blessing, perfectionism, and the good or bad impact that might have on people's spiritual life. But that I wasn't planning to talk about that. So, but others may want to go on with that. I wanted to ask Bob Ford and the whole group here, given the strong commitment that Seventh-day Adventists have to creationism, and one would imagine then to stewardship of that creation. How do we see ourselves living that out at Loma Linda University Health? Many of you are probably aware of the fact that universities and other institutions around the country have really had a lot of focused initiatives to take their environmental responsibility seriously, and especially healthcare organizations and health sciences universities have gone out of their way to develop creative approaches to reducing the negative impact that our kinds of institutions have on the environment. How do you see that happening at Loma Linda and in our surrounding community? That is Loma Linda University Health, but also in the community of Loma Linda. How are we doing as you see it compared to other forward-thinking communities in Southern California and or throughout the country? And I think I saw, I don't want to put her on the spot, but in a way I do. I think I saw Julie Unternaer here, one of our professors in the School of Medicine, who's a scientist, who's helped to lead the initiatives over there, and now I can see her in person. Happy Sabbath, Julie. Julie has heroically led initiative here at Loma Linda to think about that on campus. Most of us probably not very aware of that, but I just want to open up that part of the conversation and make it and make it personal, you might say, here at Loma Linda, especially since Bob Ford has worked with us here as a colleague for a number of years. There, that's my question.
That's a great question. And could I throw it over to J.C. Belliard, who was in the School of Public Health, but I think he's now actually in administration. Put him on the spot here a little bit. Are you in the medical center? What kinds of things have you seen at Loma Linda that bring into some of these issues?
Maybe, yeah, maybe JC and Julia can team up on that, and we'll put them both on the spot. Why not?
I'd like to allow Julie to share a little bit about what the group has been doing on campus, because I think she's spearheaded some really great work.
Okay, Julie.
I'm happy to share. I mean, JC was doing this long before I was, so really it's his job. But yeah, we've been trying, just a few of us who have a personal burden, to raise awareness, to try to do some convincing. I don't know how far we've gotten, and COVID really threw us off kilter, but I think if we bring this to our friends and colleagues in a spirit of caring for creation, you can't really argue with that. So I think we'll make progress eventually.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. I think the role of healthcare beyond just taking care of the sick, I think, is critical. I also want to lift up some of Dr. Sabate's work around diet and the environment, and how that's been critical. I think a lot of times you get more of an audience outside of your tribe than within. So I think there's been a lot of interest outside of our community, especially. But I did want to also thank Bob for the work that he's done internationally, but I think his work, and I love what you've done locally also in running for office, and I think that's something that as Adventists, we sometimes shy away from the politics of this, but if there's a way that we can influence our systems, I think it's really an important work.
All afternoon now.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience.
Coffee this morning or something?
Yeah, Stacy, I mean, JC, I should mention that I got a lot of support outside of our church, but I had some church members that really went after me saying, what am I doing running for political office, particularly when I ran as a Democrat. And that was kind of over the top for some, I guess. But it was interesting. The gentleman I ran against is a very good friend. He's a good Mormon, Southern Utah type person, but we got along well. We had interesting debates. I found going around to the communities and talking, having forums, and to discuss our relationship, particularly with issues of water and land management, became really critical. I don't know how many of you know, but our county, Washington County here in Southern Utah, up until last year was the fastest growing county in the United States. There are people moving in here from all over the world. And interesting, our little church will only have 60 to 80 church members. We're turning out to have really quite an influence, to be, people that come in from all over the world come to our church, and they're surprised to find a little Adventist church here. And it's been really satisfying to be part of a church that's supportive of what I do, and also reaches out to the community. We work closely with a non-sectarian group here that has the food pantry and homeless shelter and other activities dealing with those in need. And as I said, I also work with local groups, what's called the Virgin River Land Trust is trying to preserve agricultural land in the area, and we work with the Nature Conservancy. So I agree with what Gerald and others were saying. I think, there's that old statement, think globally, but act locally. It can be trite, but it's really important. I mean, find ways that you can influence and work locally, either the way you live. If you go back and look at some of the links that I had, if you go back and look at the pledge that Pope Francis has, there's a link at the bottom of the page that talks about action. What can you as a Christian, he doesn't say Catholic, he says as a Christian, what can you as a Christian do in your life to be a better steward and to deal with both the poor and the environment? And there's some good things in there. I really, I wish that more of us Adventists talked about this. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, yeah, Juan, I'm gonna come to you.
Does he have mute on?
Okay,
We need you to unmute yourself, yeah.
yeah, he's got it.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Bob Ford for such a magnificent presentation. I feel privileged, to listen to many topics in this Sabbath school, but the one that you addressed today is really close to my heart. The only thing I regret is I've been a faculty at the School of Public Health for many years, and I was a student 3 years ago, and I never had the privilege to take either a class from you or go with you on a field trip or do any of these, to me, very fun and very nice things. So in a way, I envy you, and I think I miss, the opportunity to really get more associated with you and learn more from you. So thank you for your presentation. The things that I want to say, and then I will try to address something of what Gerald has mentioned, is that as you presented, the issues are complex, and there is not a single-minded solution to any of these things. There is history, there is culture, there is politics, there is basically the human egoism or pride or whatever, and sometimes all of these go together and create really, the chaos and the unfortunate situation that we are doing. And I think most of us, and whether Christians or not Christians, we know that some of the natural crisis that we are in is anthropogenic, created by humans. And yes, for us Adventists, or the ones that grew up vegetarian or semi-vegetarian, we can be somehow have pride, that we're contributing to a part. But I do remember, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when my youngest one was going to Loma Academy and was very aware of all of these things, they made a survey. And as far as greenhouse gas emissions, and he thought that he was going to be the first one in the whole classroom because
the less
yes, the one with less emissions. It happens to be that year, he went to Spain to visit the grandpas during the summer, and not by boat, precisely. And also he went on a tour with the van the school van. So, and he realized very soon that, I mean, just flying, I mean, really was much more than being vegetarian. So he came, I mean, kind of depressed. I mean, when we discuss around supper time, these things. So you, Bob, and I, and many of us around here, either by being Adventists, by having listened, or in your case, being the sons of missionaries, I mean, we fly around all over the place, and yes, we can be vegetarian, but I mean, the contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions is very high, very high. Many of the Adventists, at least in my previous generation here in the States, I never seen that, but I mean, you probably know your friends or the parents of your friends had even private planes. So they could be vegetarian, but I mean, they also did their own share in really damaging the environment. So, I mean, this is just to illustrate that the issues are complex. That's the thing. And let me address this issue that you, Gerald, has asked the question. And let me return the question to you and to administration. I mean, administration in our institution is fundamentally Adventist, religiously Adventist, and well educated. So the administration knows all of these things. I mean, it's nothing new. I mean, how can decisions be made in a better way? I know we are a private institution. I mean, that, you know, the money and the bottom line, I mean, is important. No bottom line, no mission. But I'm saying, how can the administrators, I mean, make decisions that are more in accordance, I mean, with the environment?
Did you want me to speak to that, Juan?
Well, I mean, not to you, because I mean, I know that anyone, I mean, that's the thing. You know, other institutions, I mean, probably they learn about all of these things later on. I'm saying secular institutions. They didn't grow up. But I mean, we Adventists, we know all of these things, I mean, for decades. And it's also very clearly stated in the Bible, some of these things. So how can we make better decisions because we already know these things? We don't need to listen to a lecture from Bob Ford to learn about these things. We already knew intuitively and experientially some of these, not everything, but some of these.
Let me offer a comment or two, and then I'd like to see what Bob Ford has to say about this, about what he's learned working with other organizations all over the place. And also, if she's willing, Julia and JC, if you're willing, just to say what you think some of the opportunities are here at Loma Linda. I think I'm encouraged by the willingness on the part of more and more faculty and administrators to become more conscious of what we can do. Since I've worked with Julie's group a little bit, and I'm not going to take any credit for that because I've probably been the least helpful member, but I was pleased that Dr. Hart agreed to be the executive sponsor for the work rather than handing it to one of the other administrators. He saw that as a personal responsibility. I think that's encouraging, and he's been willing to address this in public ways. I think it probably starts with some shared commitment to acknowledge the importance of this for the accomplishment of our mission. You know, there are many things that we take for granted at a place like Loma Linda, that we're involved with human health, for example, and that the health of humans has a spiritual dimension. We don't really have to explain that to ourselves all the time. We've been saying that for a long time. I don't think we've had as much practice at saying what that means for care of the environment and the connection of all of those things in a comprehensive way. So I see a lot of opportunities, very practical opportunities, for example, just to make our community more walkable, more eco-friendly in a variety of ways, creating more green spaces, creating a greater urban forest, as many communities have done, and maybe not so many, but there are certainly nearby communities that have done that with considerable effect, including Redlands, which has a very effective program for that, just to pick one example. So I think that I'm not at all discouraged by what I've seen so far, but we have taken a setback with the current pandemic because we haven't been able to pursue some of the initiatives that we had in mind. I hope we can get back to it soon. That's enough for me. I don't know if the others will join in and say any more about it.
I do think there's a lot of opportunity on campus. I think an area where, well, I think our students often are ahead of us. They come from undergraduate institutions where there's been a lot of good work done. I remember one of our students chose to live in San Bernardino and didn't buy a car when he moved here. He had a bike with a sticker that said, "One less car." And it was always an inspiration. You know, we're so car-centric as a Southern California culture. And even what we build is around the car. But how can we create, like what Dr. Winslow said, a more walkable community like we're seeing on other campuses where they're closing down streets to create more walkable spaces. I do want to mention a project that I think we should all be very, very proud of. We partnered with a community organization called Huerta del Valle, the Garden of the Valley. And at the new Sac Norton site, there's a community garden that is run by the community. It's helping people grow their own food. There's all kinds of projects that they're coming up with, like aquaponics, and they have a farmer's market, and I know some of us have been part of the community-supported agriculture, and it's great. They're teaching people at the margins in our community how to compost, how to grow their own food, and during this pandemic, it's been one of the highlights of many people who live in apartment buildings and don't have the space to grow their own food. So that's something I think we can continue to support and see these community gardens grow throughout our community.
Well, that's wonderful, JC. You know, it's so easy if you follow the national and international news to be kind of to drop into despair, thinking everything is, you know, is falling apart. But no, even during this pandemic, the very fact that we can all be connected via technology without having to have a carbon footprint to all come to Loma Linda and listen to in the Centennial building and whatever. Maybe there's some blessings in all of the bad things that are happening. And I think we need to learn to listen to and see those things that are happening behind the scenes, just kind of among communities, among people, and support those. The book that the other class is reading right now about humankind, they highlight the word kind, K-I-N-D, and say that we need to learn to support the kindness that is inherent in people and in communities, and you know, and build on that. And I thank you, JC, for highlighting those. I'm sure there are many more groups doing things like that that we could support in a direct way. And I hope your class, speaking to you, David, and I know I really appreciate what you've been doing for the Restore a Child group. I've met some of their work overseas with orphans, but what we can do for community gardens, what we can do for people that are homeless or need food or, and so on, is something that's also important. But I'd like to hear from some of the others what they think that could be done.
Who's next, Forrest?
I don't have anybody on deck right now. I have a question I wouldn't mind asking, but it's not in this same vein here.
Go for it.
Okay, Bob, you know, one of the things that has really, I don't want to say bothered me, but intrigued me has been the role of Christians in response to the global warming issues. And you mentioned Miss Hayhoe. I don't want to say I've followed her a lot, but I know she has come out in favor of lower emissions, but she has received terrible letters and emails and threats on her life. Why is it, I'd say why is it, but it seems strange to me that Christians, especially evangelical Christians, are not doing what they would see Jesus doing. Your response on that.
Well, that's been the biggest disappointment, actually, in my life, particularly the last couple of years. I have received, this is a little personal, but friends that I knew from the mission field that knew my parents and my grandparents, and then during this COVID epidemic, and particularly during this very heated, polarized political environment we find ourselves in, I've received not some direct threats, but really some people that really went after me for quotes, defacing all of the value of my parents and grandparents and their life, and how could I even still be an Adventist and support issues of climate change and this and that and the other. So I can feel where Professor Hayhoe, how she feels. She's been much more upfront and better known. I mean, I'm in a way, I'm glad I'm not that well known. But that, where does that come from? The political scientists, say that we're in a uniquely polarized period. Now, this is not new. I can remember at PUC, I was a history major and took a seminar from Dr. Utt. Some of you remember Walter Utt, may have studied with him, and Dr. Syme, and they went back and talked to us about periods in American history where we've also been very polarized, very nationalistic, and so some of this is political, trends that come and go. But is there something about our particular period that is worse? I don't know. I think we're still trying to learn and how to deal with it. And I hope that the Adventist Church and Adventists can learn to be healers in this situation and not help the divide. We do need to learn to listen. I'll tell you, to listen to some of the diatribes from the other side can be very, very disconcerting. But I don't know, maybe some others have suggestions of how we deal with this.
Well, I do have Bronwyn. She's got her hand up. Did you want to get in at this point, Bronwyn?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've just noticed on the chat that JC and Stacy Belliard wrote a question, and I'd like to read this out because I think it's worth hearing. One of the positive side effects of COVID-19 is less air travel. Should we continue virtual board meetings? And I think of all the money that would be saved also, the thousands of dollars if our leaders weren't flying around the world just for board meetings. So I'd like to hear other comments on that one too.
Well, I think they could skip the spring meeting. I think one annual meeting in the fall would be good enough, and then do that as often as possible in a virtual or digital way. But I don't know why so many leaders have to get together in the spring as well as in the fall. I just think that that's a little bit much. Stay one day longer in the fall and eliminate the spring council. That would be, but I think the professional organizations like the American Academy of Religion have to think about this. 10,000 people get together, usually in some city every year, just before Thanksgiving. Get together, fly there, like we've heard, we fly there and then we read papers on the ecological crisis. But that's a little bit unfortunate. Yeah.
Well, we did see early on in the COVID-19 issue. The air was clearing in so many places like New Delhi and Mumbai, Los Angeles. And so it does show you that this is caused a large part by human beings. So anyway.
There was an article I was reading the other day from Rashida Jones and Bill Gates, and I know some people think that Bill Gates is part of the end of the world, so I won't go there. But anyway, he was pointing out that this pandemic is going to influence economy and society in ways we can't even think of yet. It's already changing the nature of work. It's changing the nature of education. I can remember, and this is a little personal story, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she studied nursing and New England Sanitarium back in 1914, 15, that period. She went to be a voluntary nurse in Puerto Rico back during World War II. And she was there for a couple of years, and then she had to come back because of World War II. And then she got caught in the influenza epidemic of 1918. And she was nursing in the Adnas Hospital there in New England Sanitarium to a former close friend of hers that they had gone to school together. And she died from the influenza, and her husband ended up being my grandfather. They married each other. The first marriage, they didn't have any kids. The second marriage, if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. And I remember her telling me lots of stories about what it was like in her life as a nurse in those early years, both in Puerto Rico and back in New England, and then when they got married and so on. And it's just very interesting. We don't know all the different ways that this whole pandemic is going to affect us personally, our families, our future, the way we work. So it's really fascinating. Good questions.
There's a question on the chat here. I'm trying to find it. Bronwyn, where?
You want me to read it out?
Yeah, please.
This was put up by Ellen DeRico to everyone. It seems that doing little personal things for the environment is never going to be enough. Is it human arrogance to think that we can save the planet by human means? Is not our dying planet a sign of end times?
Well, that's a very good question, and that is one that I hear all the time. And I think it's particularly appropriate for us as Adventists. And it's not just Adventists, but also evangelicals who believe in some ways. I've even heard some evangelicals saying, "Bring it on! Let's bring the end of the world on, so that we can have Armageddon and then go to heaven." That's. I've heard that from some Adventist brethren as well. So again, I lean on our theologians here. How do we as Adventists today deal with these ideas about end times events, as well as what it means, if we go back to the parable of Jesus, how do we behave while we're waiting for the end of the world? What's the parable of the 10 virgins? I mean, we need to rediscover what it meant to how do we live as Christians while we wait. We don't know when the end of the world is coming, and we were never asked to hasten the end of the world. Now, that's my view, but that's just my personal view. I'd like to hear the theologians talk about that.
Yeah, Ted, did you have a response to that?
No, I wanted to go back to the initial question, should we have more virtual meetings? And I just see here that people write, should we have more virtual church, right? So 1,000 cars will not go to Loma Linda. I wanted to suggest a movie, if you have not watched it, I just watched it last week, called The Giver. The Giver. It's a little bit kind of, futuristic and stuff like that, but I think that will answer the question. So I like to see my parents via Zoom or Skype or what is it, Viber, okay?
Yeah.
But I still want them to come here. Why?
We need connection.
Why? I mean, I can do church like this until the second coming. But let's just sell the building. You know, we're gonna save a lot of money and also keep the climate very clean. 1,000 cars every Sabbath. That's a lot of gas.
Yeah, we could give up on soccer too, you know, that'd be good.
Oh yeah. And look, we can do everything Zoom. So I suggest you guys watch that movie, and David, you can even have a Sabbath school on that. Seriously.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
called The Giver. Okay.
Okay.
You can watch it here. But I have another question also for Bob, if he doesn't mind. I'm a historian, so I collect stuff. Couple of things that I have collected, it's Adventist and apocalyptic predictions. Okay. And they began to, immediately after the Great Disappointment, Seventh-day Adventists began to, I mean, they were not Seventh-day Adventists at that time, but they began to predict immediately. 1845, 1847, 1851, and so on, okay? So I collect this article. It's a fascinating thing of predictions of apocalyptic, you know, second coming. But I also collect what I call ecopocalyptic predictions, okay? And those doom, you know, climate predictions. I remember in England, I read and I tried to look at my files here, and it's in The Guardian. In England, I was living at that time in 2004, when they predicted that by 2020, England will experience the Siberian climate. Okay? So there are a lot of predictions. I mean, I have a whole file of such, you know, doom predictions. And I have a question, how do you answer to these failed predictions? And should we be more careful of how we present this, you know, crisis? And because a lot of these things that have predicted and failed, I remember Al Gore, you know, when I came here in the United States, I mean, he predicted a lot of things. And just look at the dates. We are past, you know, gone with that. And we are still waiting for Jesus, right? So should we be more careful with that? And how would you answer with these failed predictions? To these failed predictions?
Very good questions, Theodore. And that's why I think I mentioned at the beginning, and it's worth reminding, that these issues are very complex. If you look at it from a scientific perspective and try to take out the politics or try to take out the polemics or the apocalyptics, all of the things you're talking about, and you try to get down to the bare facts, you know, one of the key principles from a good scientist is to use what they call the prudential view, which is we should approach all of these issues with prudence, which means we should have a certain amount of humility. We should be careful. We should realize that making absolutist statements, you know, and it's usually by the non-scientists that are taking the scientific work and misconstruing it because they have a political agenda to go along with their apocalyptics. I think that was probably the same with, you know, apocalyptics in our own church, whether it's back in the early, you know, there's nothing to get people riled up like predicting the end of the world in 2 weeks or 2 months or a year or whatever. And I think we as Adventists, we've tended, I don't know if we attract that kind of people more than others, but I think, you know, what is it? Is it a certain strain in humanity that likes to have certainty and know that they're not willing to accept ambiguity? And if you're going to look at these kinds of issues, you have to accept a lot of ambiguity and be humble about it. So I hope I wasn't being too apocalyptic in our approach. I can remember my grandfather absolutely swore, by his belief that the fall of the Ottoman Empire was going to be the end of the world. And he had these whole sermons that I used to listen to, and he'd had it all planned out as to when the Ottoman Empire was going to end, and then they were going to invade Jerusalem and so on. And it's a human trait. We like certainty, and someone comes along and has certainty and can preach it in a strong way. There's always enough people that will listen, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you. My grandfather was the same, but he preached the 2000, it's the end. So, thank you very much. I like the idea that we should promote ecology and being very careful with, because God actually said right in the beginning, right? This is their take care of it, but avoiding these apocalyptic, doom scenarios, because that just brings our credibility also down. Also with apocalyptic, predictions as well.
Yeah. When you try to go after people with those very hardline absolutist statements, it tends to turn people off, and you don't have any discussion. But I think, as you say, if you try to be kind of open about what we don't know as well as what we do know, and then calling for prudence and for humility, and then I think we can get ahead.
Okay. Where am I? I can't even. Okay, I've got 4 hands up, Dave.
I'm sorry. I see 5
hands. You're right.
Yeah. I don't know whether we should stop now and say come back next week. I think we should keep going while there's interest, and as long as Bob Ford is willing to keep going, I think we should hear each other. Unless I think those who would disagree might want to just slip away. But for those who are interested, let's keep going. I would want to say one thing now that I've got the screen, and that is the idea that history is going down, 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 down is how some people understand Adventist philosophy of history. Maybe many do. But we have to put that in context. The 19th century Adventists, and I'll defer here to Ted Leftroff, but as I understand them, the 19th century Adventists were saying the world is not inevitably getting better. That's different than saying the world is inevitably getting worse. And so the message that we should not have this kind of false optimism about the future does not necessarily mean, and it should not mean, that we have a false negativism about the future. The future is open both ways. And so I want to, some people, it's like the stock market. They want the stock market to fall down so they can make money on shorts. Well, Adventists don't have any investment in the world getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, that's not true to our heritage. That's it. Thanks for me.
Okay, I've got Juan. You want to speak again? Okay.
There is something that is I've been thinking about for some time, but since I'm not an expert, I don't know how to make progress on that. And I think I mentioned that when I made a presentation to this class a couple of years ago. And it's about the concept of eco-evangelism or green evangelism or whatever name you want to mention. I think the Adventist Church has been doing a lot for the health of the people and with the health message. I mean, since Ellen White until now, has been one of the trademarks of making evangelism in Adventism, from the 5 days to stop smoking, to the hospitals, to the home remedies, I mean, in many manifestations. My question is, nowadays that there is a clear interest in these issues that Bob so eloquently has presented, and that the younger generations are really not much interested in religion and very interested in ecology and all this. How come our church that has embraced some of these principles and ideas for many, many decades, I mean, could develop a program called green evangelism or whatever. And by that, I mean, ways for entry into the church. I mean, using the message of the improvement in ecology, or using the connection between the ecology and health, or I don't know. I mean, if I knew how to express the things and make a program, I would do, but I do not know. Maybe you, Bob, that have thought about this, have ideas of how our church develop programs. I mean, to really try to of outreach programs using the message of, I'm saying, taking care of the earth.
Well, I agree with you completely there, Dr. Zapata. Among some of the resource lists that I sent out was a link to several, there's the Ecological Evangelical Network, but there's also a Youth Evangelical Network that focuses on environment. And I've been surprised that we don't see things similar to that among Adventism. The youth of today, who are very savvy with the internet and with you know, and so on, we could be doing a lot more to bring them together. A lot of our youth, I think, don't find in our current message in our church, you know, a place where they can express themselves, whether it be artistically or whether it's about their concerns about the environment or about the future, or about hunger and about racism. We haven't talked about this, but you know, a lot of the political issues that really are dividing us are deep-seated in our institutions and even in our churches. And if we don't stand up, if we're just afraid to speak because of the fear of what the bureaucracy of the conference president or what someone else will say, we're not reaching out to our, you know, to our youth of today. So no, it's definitely a challenge. Maybe Stacy knows some things that are happening. What will keep the young people in our church today?
If this, and that is a question in general, if this is considered relevant, I mean, what entity in the church could be the one to start working in this direction? I mean, Andrews University is more in theology. I mean, the General Conference, Department of whatever. We have to just get together as individuals and try to do something as an outline. I mean, I would like to participate, but I mean, I don't have the tools, neither the, you know, all the global concepts to put such a program together. But I think that is really very necessary.
No, absolutely. You know, having movements, you know, I've traveled some in Europe, and because I have my older son and our two grandkids live there, went to the Adventist church in Geneva and also in Lausanne. And I was impressed by the number of young people, and many of them are there from all around the world. They're studying or they work for the UN or things like that. And I was amazed to find that some churches, and it depends on the congregation, you know, some congregations seem to create an environment where there's openness and there's discussion and there's challenge and there's involvement with the community. And then others are trying to retreat into an old cell, you know, themselves preserve what they think Adventism was maybe 50 or 100 years ago. And you have to kind of be lucky to land in a place where where young people are still received and protected. But that's not enough. I think I heard you're saying that, you know, what are we as an institution, as a church organization? How often have these issues been brought up at the annual meetings or the biannual meetings of the conference, Pacific Union Conference or Southern Southeastern Conference? How often does this come up as an issue at camp meetings or whatever? I think, yeah, there's much more that we could do on an institutional level.
Okay, thank you. Eduardo.
Okay. When I watch the news, they are saying that the Pope is trying to save the world. And if you go save from what, he's saying that from global warming. But I look to Genesis 8:22 says, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So I don't believe in the global warming because this text. That's just one comment. The other comment that I want to make is I remember listening in the radio a long time ago. The gambling was prohibited by the moral power. And I think that the church has lost the moral power, and they are trying, especially Catholics and apostate Protestants are trying to use the power of the state. In Romans 1 says that the gospel is the power of God. So I think that we don't need any new program. The General Conference starts once every year. I mean, once every year. They start with revival and reformation, I will go, and many other initiatives. We don't need any more of that. We need the power of God. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Eduardo. I want to go, I see I'm looking at my list here. I've got JC and Stacy next. Your hand is up.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question of Dr. Ford. In listening to all the comments and questions, well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And for me personally, it seems so obvious that something needs to and can be done. And it is our responsibility as Christians to care for God's creation. But as we're listening even to the variety of comments within this small class, we can see that's not the reaction from everyone. And I'm listening and thinking of some of the barriers to acting on this creation care topic. And some of them that come up obviously are theology and maybe the perceived futility of being able to make a difference. But I feel like one of the underlying issues is the either inability or unwillingness to have a real empathy and sense of urgency about these issues from those who have the power to do something about it. Because as the major consumers of resources in this earth, we have probably unconsciously, for most of us, at least in this class, set up the game so that it's not affecting us as much as those in the margins who don't have the power to make a difference. Now that is going to change eventually, where even we are going to be affected. But I wonder if it is necessary or even possible to decouple issues of creation care from politics in order to remove that barrier and to present solutions not in a way of promoting a sense of having to sacrifice either lifestyle or income or, national economy, but more innovation, new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking about things. And as Christians, shouldn't we be leading in some of those innovations?
Good points, JC. I think what you're getting at is something, while I worked at the State Department, there was something that we were focusing on, that there is a lot of good that's happening. It's easy to see, everything kind of going to hell in a handbasket and not realize that there are a lot of positive changes that are occurring and that could be that are that could save us or actually save us. There are several scientists that have been evaluating on changes in behavior and consumerism and technology and other things around the world. So it's not all terrible. And if you go back and look at the film that David Attenborough has, he talks about some of those solutions. There are movements that we can support about how we better use agriculture, how we better change diets, how we better change use of energy, and so on. So it's, you know, we don't have to, I don't think apocalyptic, you know, scare tactics work in any kind of a system, but that helping people to find solutions that fit their society, their culture, their time, I think is what we need. And we have to have a certain amount of patience with change. Now, in terms of getting involved with politics, that has been a difficult one for me. I think for Adventists in general, you know, we've come up in a history, particularly whether it was labor unions or whether it was the temperance movement or whether it's a lot of things. We have a history of thinking that politics is bad and we should not be involved with politics. But I think we should remember that politics is about collectively as a group, not as individuals, but as a group, trying to make better decisions for future generations. We will make mistakes. It will take time. We experiment, we go forward, we go back. It's not a perfect thing. You know, they call it political science, but it's more art than science. And, you know, politics is something that I think particularly for Adventists has been a difficult issue to know how to be involved or in what way to be involved. There are definitely dangers of getting too involved, but not getting involved is also a danger. So I'd like to hear what some of the others say about it. Maybe Dave, what do you tell your social ethics or Christian ethics classes about politics and religion, politics and Adventism? Is that an unmitigated disaster, or is that something we need to be more cognizant of?
Well, just very quickly, I think that we should be encouraging our people to get more involved in politics. I think particularly at the local level,
right?
The school board, the county commission. When we think of politics, we often think of statewide or national politics, but there's an awful lot going on even in my homeowners association that we can be attentive to. I think we should have seminars on how Adventists can be politically effective at the local level, particularly. But moving on.
Okay. By the way, if you folks don't know, but Paul Ruiz, who is the congressman for, I can't remember the district, that's one down there where David lives, is a Seventh-day Adventist, and he's in the Congress again. So we're trying to get him to come here sometime. So, I'm sorry, Raul Ruiz. Okay. McKinley, I think I have you the last one. Go, McKinley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forrest. Thank you, Dr. Ford, for your presentation. I just wonder if I can broaden the dimension of the conversation a little bit. First, I think the arguments and disagreement on this topic of climate change, quote unquote, has to do with how it has been framed over the years. Personally, in my work, I prefer to use the term climate emissions. And what I've found is with that term, that encourages, opens up the dialogue, and people begin to then rethink their positions or their dispositions towards the challenge. The second observation is that solving the challenge of climate emissions is very difficult. And I talk about this from the experience of having played or having the privilege of playing the role in leading California's efforts at 2 agencies to address this challenge. California has had, I think, a unique role in dealing with the issue of climate emissions. The state has taken bold policy actions and has made monetary commitments to achieving climate objectives. For example, the joint agency work of both the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission that I was privileged to lead set the carbon intensity standards for all of the fuels across transportation and power generation. That's a work that took about 5 years of my life. Other actions that the state has taken include the executive order that I think it was Governor Brown signed that requires the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel fuels sold in the state to be reduced by about 30% by 2030. Senate Bill 100 requires the electricity generated in California to be carbon neutral by 2045. But this is just one example of one jurisdiction acting, and not every jurisdiction around the world has the resources, both financial and technical, that California has to set up the framework for action. The last thing I want to observe is in response to the question, what can the Adventist Church do about climate emissions? I think one way is to educate our students at Adventist schools to equip them so that they can influence climate-friendly outcomes. While I'm a mechanical engineer and I'm very privileged to have that background, I don't talk about my college education as much as I talk about the preparation that I received at my Adventist school, because that positioned me to do very well later on in college and put me in the role that I was privileged to play here in California. So across those 3 topics, it's a difficult challenge. And I think the church can play a big role by continuing to educate its students to do well in positioning themselves to influence outcomes on this topic.
Well, thank you very much. California has been a trendsetter in many ways, and I appreciate the work that you've done. I remember when I was in the federal government, we followed quite closely some of the things that Caltech and others were doing. And so there are some big ideas, there are some policy changes that definitely over time will improve. But I think the question that I think you raised that is most important is, what are we doing about preparing the next generation? We have one of the largest parochial schools in the world. Our education system could have a tremendous influence on the next generation, because these issues are really generational issues. They're not just something that we can take care of over 2 or 3 years and be done with it. It's about preparing the next generation to live more sustainably. It's about learning the value of science. It's about learning the value of cooperation and collaboration, about dealing with greed and equity and inequity and so on. So absolutely, I just, and that's where I think the real influence will be, is in our schools, going down to the elementary and high schools and up to college level. I just hope that those of you, I know Loma Linda has an academy and a large elementary school. How many of you either have grandkids or kids that are in those schools? Have you looked at the curriculum lately? What are our kids learning in school? How are you influencing them? Because they're the ones that are going to make the changes. It's not us. Most of us are over the hill.
Yeah, that point can't be overemphasized enough. I think, again, the network of Adventist schools can play a very, very big role in shaping the environmental outcomes of the future. And I hope the educators listening in on this conversation take that to heart. Because again, my studies of science and math at the academy level positioned me to play the unique role that I believe I've been blessed to play in shaping some of the policy outcomes here in the States.
You know, in a positive sense, while I was in Rwanda, but also traveling around the world, I've usually tried to visit the local Adventist school or church. And I know in Rwanda, one of the young men that came up in our Adventist school, and he went to the university and ended up coming to be, he's an atmospheric scientist that studied in the United States. He's gone back, he's now head of a whole community program in Rwanda that deals with reforestation and energy efficiency and so on in the local community. He has his own NGO. This is just one Adventist kid that I know that's having a huge influence. But this is happening around the world. I can remember going to the Adventist school there in Lubumbashi and finding a school teacher that was taking his kids out on doing community service, learning science in the field. Was tremendous, and this was at our Adventist school, and I was really impressed. So anything we can do to support what our schools do and our teachers to give them support is really, really recommended. So Forrest, and I don't know how long you want to go. We've gone over. Maybe we should talk about, do we continue this next week, or do we take off on any, because there are several issues that are related to this. I mean, we talked about climate refugees, immigration. There are issues, we could come back and talk next week about some of those other things. We could talk about economy, or there's a lot more to be said about the theological issues. David, how do you want to proceed, or do you want to come back later and have another presentation? Maybe give us some guidance here.
For sure, let's get together next week. We could even have a whole session looking at the videos we bypassed in this presentation. There were half a dozen good videos there. We could have a whole hour just watching those videos and then discussing them. So let's, you and I chat. We don't have to get it all done this week or next week. This is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So yeah, let's you and I talk. Julie had her hand up for a long time. I wonder if she wants to say something as the last word, or should we not?
Well, I can say what I was thinking of saying. We come together every Sabbath to worship the Creator who made our beautiful world. And I think whether we're at the end of the world or not, I think most of us believe that we are, but we want to honor him by taking care of his creation. So it's just a motivator for me to make sure that plastic doesn't get into the ocean, simple things like that. So I think thinking of this issue in terms of respecting our Creator by respecting what he created, for me, is meaningful.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Dave, I like maybe next week we'll go back and look at some of the videos I skipped over from Catherine Hayhoe. There's also the Bishop of Honduras. There's a very interesting thing about climate refugees. There's a short kind of preview of the David Attenborough film. We could look at some of those and then talk a little bit more about some of the implications of this. And
I would like that, because we haven't done justice to this presentation of yours. And before we start another one, I think we ought to return and do greater justice to this. So let's think of that. Let's have a playlist of those videos, and we'll go right through them.
Okay. So
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll work on it, and then you can send out a notice, and we'll continue this next week. Yeah.
Okay. One last comment from me, and then I'll have the benediction. And that is, in the chat, I was asked if my vegetarian rant, if my vegetarian rant was a response to Pastor McGill Mendez's sermon recently, I gather, at the Loma University Church, in which he apparently addressed this issue and took a somewhat different stand than I did. And the answer is no, I did not hear that presentation. I don't know what his position on these matters are. I am by no means reacting to one of my pastors at the university church. So it was sort of an impromptu, not quite impromptu, rant. So that's that. Okay, here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
By the way, I mentioned that the Belly Art put a link that you might want to get before we close down. It looks pretty interesting about sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ford.
Thank you. We'll see you next week. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome. Mhm.
That was really, really wonderful.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you, Bob. It was great.
Okay.
Did you win your county commission seat?
No, I didn't, but I got more votes than any Democrat has ever gotten. So I feel good. So
You should run as a Republican.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, if I'd have run as a Republican, I probably would have won. But anyway, but that's kind of the way it is. I saw it more as I had been the head of the planning commission, our little town, for the previous 5 years. So I saw it more as an opportunity to discuss issues countywide that affect Zion National Park and where we live and so on. So it was a good experience. I'm actually glad I didn't win, because then I would have to deal with all of the problems.
Are you going to run again?
I don't know. There are people that are asking me if I should run again, but I've kind of enjoyed just kind of living on my ranch and doing my photography, and we want to go back to Europe and spend some time with our grandkids before they grow up. So I don't know, but I'm willing to get involved again in some way. I don't know. I didn't mention this, but when I went to Washington, D.C., I went to work for the Al Gore Center